Something cracked inside Europe on March 10th, and the sound of it is still echoing through every capital from Rome to Brussels to Berlin. This was not a military confrontation. This was not a border dispute. This was a single woman standing in front of the most powerful institutional machinery on the continent and saying the word that Brussels has spent decades engineering its systems to make impossible to say. No. Giorgia Meloni did not just block a funding plan. She did not simply raise an objection in a committee room. She walked into the center of European financial governance and challenged the foundational assumption that has held the entire Brussels power structure together since the Union expanded. The assumption that when the Commission moves, member states eventually follow. That assumption is now in serious question, and the 210 billion euro plan sitting frozen at the heart of this confrontation is only the visible surface of a conflict whose real depth goes all the way down to the question of whether the European Union is still a union of equals or whether it has quietly become something else entirely. Stay with us, because what happens in the coming weeks will define the architecture of European power for the next generation. To understand the full explosive weight of what Meloni has done, you need to go back to the moment in early 2022 when European governments made a decision that felt straightforward at the time but carried legal and financial consequences that are only now fully detonating. When Russia launched its full invasion of Ukraine, the Western response moved with unusual speed. Within weeks, approximately 300 billion euros in Russian sovereign assets, money belonging to the Russian central bank held inside European financial institutions, were frozen and placed beyond Moscow's reach. The largest single portion of that sum sat inside Euroclear, the Belgian financial clearinghouse that sits at the center of European securities settlement and processes volumes that make it one of the most systemically significant financial institutions on the continent. The freezing of those assets was framed publicly as a temporary pressure measure, a signal of economic consequence attached to military aggression, a tool designed to sit in reserve while diplomacy attempted to find its footing. The legal position underpinning that framing was that sovereign assets enjoy robust international protections and that outright seizure and redeployment of those funds would cross a line that European institutions were not prepared to cross. That position held for a period. Then the war continued. Ukraine's reconstruction costs climbed into figures that strained every existing funding mechanism. Political will across Western governments began showing the kind of fatigue that prolonged conflicts always eventually produce. And inside the European Commission, a different kind of thinking began to take shape. The frozen assets were sitting there, 300 billion euros immobilized and generating interest. What if, rather than seizing them directly, which remained legally and politically problematic, the Commission constructed a mechanism that used those assets as collateral, borrowed against them, issued financial instruments backed by the eventual availability of that frozen capital, and deployed the proceeds into a large-scale, long-term support package for Ukraine's defense and reconstruction needs? The number that began appearing in internal Commission discussions was 210 billion euros. The mechanism was described as collateralization rather than confiscation. The legal distinction was presented as meaningful and protective. But the mechanism required a pathway through European treaty law that would allow the Commission to move without securing unanimous approval from all 27 member states. Under standard EU decision-making procedures, a financial operation of this scale and this legal novelty would require every single government to agree. Any one of the 27 could exercise a veto and kill the plan entirely. The Commission's lawyers identified what they believed was a viable alternative pathway: Article 122 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, an emergency provision originally drafted to allow faster collective action during acute economic disruptions, energy shocks, supply crises, situations where the normal pace of European deliberation created unacceptable delays with real consequences. Under Article 122, the unanimity requirement could be bypassed. Qualified majority support would be sufficient to move forward. The veto power of individual member states would be neutralized. Brussels looked at this provision and saw a solution. Rome looked at it and saw something else entirely. When the details of the Commission's legal strategy reached the Italian government, The reaction from Meloni's administration was immediate, structured, and deliberately framed not as political opposition, but as legal defense. Italy's objection was not presented as disagreement with supporting Ukraine. It was presented as a challenge to the proportionality of invoking emergency treaty powers for a purpose those powers were never designed to serve. European treaty law does not permit emergency provisions to be triggered simply because a situation is large, difficult, or morally urgent. It requires that the measure being taken is genuinely proportionate to an acute economic emergency threatening the functioning of the Union itself. Italy's legal position was precise, and it was devastatingly targeted. Ukraine reconstruction funding, however critical, does not constitute the kind of immediate existential economic shock to EU member states that Article 122 was designed to address. Using it to push through a €210 billion financial operation involving frozen foreign sovereign assets was, in Rome's formal assessment, an illegitimate application of emergency powers and one that European courts would be highly likely to strike down if subjected to a direct legal challenge. Within days of Italy raising formal objections, the coalition Meloni was assembling became visible. Belgium, whose territory hosts Euroclear itself, joined the resistance, carrying its own acute awareness of the legal and reputational exposure that comes with being the jurisdiction where foreign sovereign assets are leveraged without unimpeachable legal foundation. Bulgaria and Malta, smaller member states with considerably less institutional weight than Italy, but with their own clear understanding of what the erosion of unanimity requirements means for their ability to protect national interests inside an institution dominated by larger economies, added their formal objections. The bloc Meloni had constructed was not a pro-Russia coalition. It was not a group of governments seeking to shield Moscow from financial consequences. It was something structurally more significant and institutionally more threatening to Brussels than either of those things. It was a coalition united by the conviction that the method being used to advance this plan was more dangerous to the long-term integrity of the European Union than the funding gap it was designed to fill. 15 a.m. And inside the European Commission, the impact of that coalition landing on Ursula von der Leyen's desk was something her institutional machinery had not been engineered to absorb. The €210 billion plan had been constructed with a specific political logic in mind. The moral weight of Ukraine's situation, combined with the technical sophistication of the collateral mechanism, was assumed to be sufficient to generate the political momentum necessary to carry the plan forward over whatever objections individual governments might raise. What the Commission had fundamentally miscalculated was the character and the framing of the opposition it would face. Meloni did not position herself as an obstructionist. She did not position herself as a Eurosceptic using a convenient issue to score domestic political points. She positioned herself as the defender of European law against an institution that was preparing to exceed its own legal authority under the pressure of political urgency. That framing was not merely effective. It was structurally unassailable in a way that purely political opposition never is. You can negotiate with a government that wants something in exchange for dropping its objection. You cannot easily negotiate with a government that has staked its position on a legal principle it has already articulated publicly before the entire European legal community. Buying off a constitutional argument with a road infrastructure package or a favorable budget allocation is not a transaction that survives public scrutiny. And Meloni understood this perfectly when she chose the ground on which to fight. Von der Leyen now faced a dilemma with no clean exit. If the Commission pushed forward and Italy formally challenged the use of Article 122 before the European Court of Justice, the entire plan faced the prospect of being frozen under an injunction for years while the legal proceedings moved at the pace European judicial processes characteristically maintain. Ukraine's reconstruction and defense funding needs do not pause for treaty interpretation disputes. The political window during which large-scale financial commitments of this kind are viable is narrow, and it closes as domestic pressures in key member states accumulate, and the sense of moral urgency that makes expensive foreign commitments politically defensible gradually erodes. Every month of legal paralysis would be a month in which that window narrowed further. Meloni understood the timeline as well as anyone in Brussels, and her legal challenge was not simply a substantive objection. It was a precisely calibrated strategic instrument designed to weaponize the Commission's own timeline against it. If von der Leyen pulled back and restructured the mechanism, she would hand Meloni a victory whose lessons would reverberate through every future EU financial battle. Every government that had ever wanted to slow a Brussels initiative would absorb the demonstration that the legal challenge, the coalition of resistance, and the public framing of opposition as treaty defense, rather than political obstruction, constituted a toolkit that worked against the most powerful institutional actor in Europe. That lesson, once absorbed into the political culture of EU member state governments, cannot be unabsorbed. The Commission's internal response shifted from confidence to crisis management with a speed that itself revealed how seriously Brussels was taking the challenge. Legal teams were directed to examine alternative frameworks that could deliver the same financial outcome through treaty provisions carrying less vulnerability to the proportionality argument Italy had deployed. One option under internal consideration involved restructuring the mechanism to sit under different legal foundations within the treaty architecture. Another involved the kind of side negotiations Brussels has historically used to dissolve opposition, identifying the price of each dissenting government's objection and paying it through concessions on unrelated policy matters. But the second option ran directly into the problem Meloni's framing had deliberately created. Her opposition was on the record as a matter of legal principle, a principle she had articulated not as a preference, but as a constitutional necessity. The architecture of that position made it resistant to the transactional diplomacy that Brussels deploys as its standard instrument for managing member state resistance. Meanwhile, the geopolitical clock continued running entirely indifferent to European institutional politics. Every week the dispute continued was a week in which the gap between Ukraine's needs and the funding available to meet them widened with consequences that were not abstract. The Commission attempted to leverage this reality directly against Meloni, framing her legal precision as carrying a human cost measured in Ukrainian lives and infrastructure. It was emotionally powerful. It was also institutionally dangerous in a way that cut to the heart of what this confrontation was actually about. Because if the logic that moral urgency justifies exceeding legal constraints is accepted once inside European institutions, it does not stay contained to the specific circumstances that justified it the first time. It becomes available as a justification the next time a commission decides that an objective is important enough to warrant moving faster than the treaty allows. And the next time that logic is deployed, the cause may not carry the same moral clarity that supporting Ukraine commands across most of the European political spectrum. This is the argument beneath Meloni's argument, the one she may not always state in these precise terms, but that gives her position its structural coherence and its long-term significance. European institutions cannot selectively honor their own legal foundations based on the perceived urgency of the political moment. That principle is either maintained absolutely or it dissolves into a permission structure for whoever holds institutional power to define emergencies in whatever way serves their current objectives. The smaller member states standing beside Rome grasp this with particular clarity because for them, the unanimity requirement is not a procedural formality. It is the primary mechanism through which nations of their size retain meaningful agency inside an institution whose center of gravity sits with the larger economies. Belgium's presence in the coalition carried its own specific weight, given that Euroclear sits on Belgian territory and the reputational exposure of being the jurisdiction where foreign sovereign assets are leveraged without legally unimpeachable foundations falls directly on Brussels in both senses of that word. 16 Emirates. And the investor confidence dimension of Italy's opposition carried a weight that extended far beyond the immediate legal dispute and into territory that financial markets were already beginning to price with quiet but unmistakable urgency. Meloni's government had raised a question that no amount of institutional communication from Brussels could make disappear through reassurance alone. If the European Union possesses the practical capacity to freeze the sovereign assets of one state and then construct financial instruments leveraging those frozen assets to fund a third party, what does that communicate to every sovereign wealth fund manager, every central bank reserve officer, and every institutional investor currently holding assets inside European financial jurisdiction about the security of their own positions? The question was not hypothetical. It was not the invention of governments looking for arguments to dress up political obstruction in legal clothing. It was a question being asked in private by serious financial actors whose decisions about where to place capital shape the conditions under which European governments borrow, European banks fund themselves, and the euro maintains its standing as the world's second most traded reserve currency. The answer that honest analysis produces from that question is deeply uncomfortable for an institution that depends on global confidence in the integrity of its financial and legal systems. Assets held inside European jurisdiction are protected by law and by treaty until a political emergency of sufficient weight makes it convenient for those in institutional authority to treat the legal protections as negotiable. Once that perception achieves critical mass inside the global investment community, it does not retreat when the specific emergency that created it passes. It becomes a permanent adjustment to the risk premium attached to European financial exposure. Italy was arguing that the reputational damage to European financial markets from proceeding with this plan without ironclad legal foundation could over time outweigh the immediate financial benefit delivered to Ukraine. That was a serious argument advanced by serious people, and the Commission's response to it had been almost entirely political rather than substantively legal. Brussels had not produced a clean answer to the proportionality challenge. It had not produced a clean answer to the investor confidence challenge. What it had deployed was the moral weight of Ukraine's situation, the institutional momentum of a large bureaucracy moving in a determined direction, and the implicit pressure on dissenting governments that opposing this plan placed them on the wrong side of a story that most European publics understood in binary terms. Against that combination, Meloni had constructed a position that was proving remarkably durable because its foundations were legal rather than political, and because the coalition she had assembled gave it a breadth that made it impossible to dismiss as the idiosyncratic resistance of a single government with a domestic political agenda to manage. The European Council meeting approaching on the calendar was therefore not simply another scheduled gathering of heads of government to manage the routine business of continental administration. It had become the arena in which a confrontation that had been building across weeks of legal argument, coalition construction, and institutional maneuvering would have to find some form of resolution or escalate into a more open and more damaging conflict between Rome and Brussels than either side had originally anticipated when this dispute first crystallized. Von der Leyen's options had narrowed considerably from the position of institutional confidence from which the plan had originally been launched. The legal restructuring her teams were examining would take time and would require acknowledging that the original mechanism was legally vulnerable, an acknowledgement that itself handed Meloni a partial vindication. The side negotiation pathway was blocked by the public and principled character of Italy's stated position. The option of simply pushing forward and absorbing the legal challenge carried the risk of a years-long freeze that destroyed the Ukraine funding timeline entirely, and the option of retreating fully and renegotiating the entire approach from its foundations carried the cost of demonstrating to every EU member government that a sufficiently determined and legally sophisticated resistance coalition could stop the Commission's most ambitious initiatives in their tracks. None of these outcomes were acceptable from Brussels' perspective. All of them were on the table. And which one materialized depended on a variable that institutional analysis struggles to model with precision. Which side would absorb the pressure of the approaching deadline and make the first significant concession? Because deadlines in European institutional politics do not function as pure forcing mechanisms. They function as pressure that falls unevenly, depending on which parties have more to lose from the specific outcome that a missed deadline produces. The Commission had more to lose from legal paralysis than from a restructured mechanism. Italy had more to lose from being seen as the government whose legal objections caused Ukraine's funding to collapse than from accepting a modified framework that preserved the essential principle of unanimity protection.